Welcome in, and thanks so much for joining me. In today's episode, I'd like to discuss vulnerability in Buddhist practice. And this is a big one for me. It really relates to a lot of different areas. So we'll see where we meander in our discussion today. And as always, I encourage you to reach out, share the video if you like it, share the episode if you are enjoying listening to it. And you can always reach out to me at scotttusa.com, or you can comment if you're watching on YouTube. As I said, this is a big one, so I may not hit all areas. So let me know in comments if there's anything I missed that you want to also point out. So generally, I just want to discuss sort of that naturally, at least early on, Buddhist practice and study is kind of meant to bring up vulnerability, right? In a positive sense, right? Because we can have vulnerability arising that we need to actually think quickly or skillfully on in order to prevent harm, right? So there's vulnerability that we need to protect ourselves and others from, right? Just like, let's say, something that's going to physically harm us. But then there's also types of vulnerability of opening the heart, of developing loving kindness and compassion, being in touch with our feeling world, which just means our emotions, sensations, etc., in a wholesome way, in a way that's going to help us grow wisdom and compassion. And this is the latter type of vulnerability that is positive, that is helpful, that when we open ourselves up to the wounds around that vulnerability or the uncomfort around it, we actually grow. So basically, there's certain kinds of vulnerability that don't encourage growth. It's just sort of something we need to protect from in life, at least as long as we have a body, right? And there's some vulnerability that if we actually don't connect with it and we don't deepen our connection to that vulnerability, it's difficult to grow. It's difficult to grow compassion and wisdom. So first, I think we're developing a courage to feel. And what this means is a willingness to be with the discomfort of emotions, thoughts that we don't particularly like, that we often reject, suppress, or try to fix or analyze our way out of. So the first step is learning practices that help to connect us into the body and the felt presence and awareness of sensations, emotions, different energy movement as it's arising. So I talk about this in other content, as well as I have guided meditations on my website. So this would in particular refer to something called the handshake practice, which comes from my main teacher, Soknim Rinpoche. So you can go to the source. He has a wonderful course called Fully Being at fullybeing.org. And you can contact his teachings on handshaking. He also has books available. Why We Meditate is a great book. So you can also read about the practice there. And then, of course, he has lots of teachings and guided meditations. Because he's my main teacher, and the practice also has really worked for me and worked for many people I work with. I highly recommend it. And I have also content on it because it's such a transformative practice. So I also have some guided meditations, like I said, as well as other kinds of episodes on it that you can go back to. So I'm not going to talk too much about the practice, but what I will say is the practice itself is about getting in touch with the tenderness of our feeling world. And tenderness here means we don't sort of promote the tenderness, we just stop suppressing it and getting hijacked by it and trying to fix or change it. And we learn to be with it, right? So this is a big part of opening to vulnerability and how it can, just help us in life and to work with emotional discomfort. But eventually that can lead into the traditional Buddhist path, which I'll describe in a moment. So why I recommend this kind of doorway, because there's many doorways into vulnerability, but why I often recommend this doorway first is even those of us who are kind of longtime Buddhist practitioners, we can sometimes get stuck in sort of this view or way of being where the Dharma comes in and it just gets stuck in the head and we don't know how to embody it. And, this isn't necessarily our faults. I don't think it's a fault of traditional Buddhism. It's just a cultural issue where a lot of us in the modern world don't learn how to be in the body, or we don't even learn the intelligence of the body and how to work with that, right? So somatic meditations as well as somatic practices can be really helpful for us to gain that kind of wisdom and knowledge on the embodied level, right? And so that's often, that doesn't necessarily have to be the first step. Maybe we study Buddhism for a while and we, develop a sense of vulnerability with, let's say, the First Noble Truth, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But that still needs to be felt, right? Meaning, because a lot of our discomfort, a lot of our dukkha or suffering happens in the body, right? It doesn't just happen in the mind. It happens through perception, mind, and body. So I just recommend that. So whether you're a longtime Buddhist practitioner or kind of newer to meditation and Buddhism, work with some practices on vulnerability with the feeling world. As I usually say, like getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. So aside from that, in the traditional Buddhist path, we have immediately the teachings on sort of, life as dissatisfactory. Not that life needs to always be dissatisfactory, but just that dissatisfaction will arise in life. That's really what the teaching means. That inevitably, if we're born, we're going to have to experience dissatisfaction. And, initially the Buddha taught this through what are called the four rivers of birth, old age, sickness, and death, because those are absolutely inevitable for all of us. Once we're born, we're going to have to age. We're going to get, various kinds of sicknesses. And then eventually we have to go through the discomfort and the dissatisfaction and pain of dying, right? Not that dying always has to be painful, but, shifting from an embodied experience in a human form where we perceive from that, when that all starts to fall away, it's pretty shocking, I think, for most people, to say the least, right? And that doesn't have to be a negative experience, but it is quite a strong experience for most. I haven't experienced it, obviously, because I'm still alive. So I've just heard from, others who spend a lot of time with people in the dying process and also being around that a little bit myself. So either way, this First Noble Truth of dukkha isn't just talking about these four rivers. Those are just the obvious ones that are inevitable. But of course, all of us experience all kinds of, most of us experience all kinds of emotional pain, ups and downs, things going our way sometimes, things not going our way, attachments, aversions, all kinds of things, right? And if we really study the mind and we look at the mind and we use meditation to be aware of the thinking mind and emotions and everything, what we'll notice is that our internal experience is often in some kind of a tug of war with reality or so-called reality, meaning, we're either craving something and we're trying to get that, or we're, feeling aversion to something and we're trying to move away from it. And sometimes this can be, very obvious, right? If something's very painful, we're going to, generally move away from it. But a lot of the times it's more subtle, right? It's more sort of a subtle version of like, we just get sick of sitting, so we want to get up. And then we get up, we walk around, we do things. We get sick of that, and then we sit down again, right? So this is kind of common to human life. And the Buddha also described that as a form of dukkha, or, dissatisfactoriness. Dukkha can be translated as many things, sometimes suffering, pain, dissatisfaction. There's many ways to think of it. But often we wouldn't think of sort of, sitting for too long, unless we have a lot of physical pain, we wouldn't think of it as sort of painful, right? So if there's no physical pain, but we just feel itchy and we need to get up, that's kind of a type of dissatisfaction, right? So that goes into the category of suffering for Buddhists. And how vulnerability applies here is we need to open up a process with that, of being vulnerable with and to that type of dissatisfaction, where we don't immediately avoid it. Instead, we look at it. So generally, we use meditation as a way to cultivate mindful awareness and a way to then investigate or observe life. Life when it's going well, life when it's not going well. And in particular, these kinds of subtle aversions and clingings that are happening, all kinds of hooks that we get hooked into. We can use the word attachment or clinging. We get attached to or cling to, but also the things we seek to avoid. And one way to do this is to ask questions. So working with vulnerability, we can use curiosity as a tool and sort of more open questions, asking, what is this really about? What's going on here, right? And we observe with awareness. So that's one way to work with it. Also, in the beginning especially, we study the Dharma because this is not something we have to reinvent. There are thousands and thousands of practitioners who have sort of gone through various paths of Buddha Dharma and have, the fruit of their practice it has been written down and described to help us in the modern world, right? And those teachings still apply. I think they apply even more. And so what's wonderful here is we can study that not as a form of, attempting to be a believer or a religious person, but as a form of something that we can use for our personal investigation, right? So it doesn't mean we have to believe what the particular practitioner or commentator or guru is saying, but we take it in as information to point us in a certain direction, towards a certain kind of internal investigation into our own minds, perceptions, the world around us and all of that. So I highly recommend that because it just saves time. It's like we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. All of this at the end of the day needs to be extremely personal, whether we initially read it in a book or not, right? So I think it's sort of like not so wise to sort of think, I can do this all on my own. We need help, especially with the landscape of mind and emotions, because it's just can be very confusing and confounding, right? Especially when we're very stuck in our thoughts and emotions and thinking. So often vulnerability looks like, studying what samsara is, which is this nature of circling, right? In dualistic mind and from life to life. So we study what that means on sort of outer, inner, and more secret levels. We gain familiarity with the language, with the terminology. And then, of course, we apply that to our own experience, using our meditation practice, mindful awareness to investigate, right? So these things kind of work in tandem. And usually we have a process of 3 wheels we work with, learning or studying the Dharma, contemplating it, right? And then meditating on whatever conviction we have formed through contemplation and study. And of course, we have the traditional practices of shamatha or meditative awareness, calm abiding, and then all different kinds of vipassana or insight meditation to help with this. So we can train in those. But why are we training in those? Are we training in those to just get good at meditation? No. We're training in those to be more vulnerable with our human experience. So we can learn, so we can grow, so we can become more free. That's the whole point. So unfortunately, we become free by going in, not by going out, right? So there's a quote I really like from a great teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, who said, the magic is that there's a way in. Right? That's the magic. And so, of course, that runs counterintuitive because often, when we're feeling uncomfortable or resistance or aversion, we turn away, right? We don't want to lean in. But of course, as we grow in our meditation practice and our study of the Dharma and understanding, we start to trust leaning in more. And leaning in is another version of vulnerability, right? Vulnerability in Dharma practice, meditation, Buddhist practice, all of that. So I don't think I want to say too much because I think that's plenty to work with, especially if some of this is new to you. But just to recap, so we have these elements of the courage to feel, of working with embodied somatic practices to meet and let be with our feeling experience. And of course, we learn through that letting be. It's not about finding ease, over here and all the disturbing emotions are over here and we're pushing them away. It's actually finding ease within the way we're being with difficult emotions and sensations, or all kinds of, constrictions in the physical body or in the energy body. So we work with that through certain somatic practices I already talked about. And then, of course, we also work with the traditional Buddhist path of understanding, what is life? What is this predicament of our human experience? And how can we get to know it more? So we seek to know it so that we can become free. That's the whole path here. And that's a deep vulnerability as well, right? So I encourage you in this. And again, this is like a general overview. So for specifics, feel free to reach out. I can always recommend material or books. But, it's a very deep dive when we're talking about the Buddhist path. It's not something you can be like, here's the 5 steps. And it's not like that. It's sort of like, it's like you work with one layer and then you work with another, and then it widens over time and deepens. I guess I would say for someone completely new to Buddhism, if you're watching or listening to this, pursue teachings on the Four Noble Truths. So you can find books, you can find YouTube videos on that. I have some content on that. Dig into that, because that's not only the Buddha's first teaching historically, but it's also, I would say, the most profound and the one that remains a thread through all teachings, in all what we call three yanas in Himalayan Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths apply. So it's never going to steer you wrong, and there's always something to deepen within the Four Noble Truths, because it's the whole path. So I recommend that, right? But of course, there's much, much more, but I think, sometimes less is more. All right, well, thanks so much. And as always, feel free to reach out. You can comment if you're watching on YouTube, or you can reach out to me at scotttusa.com on my website, and just send me a private message if you want. Thanks so much, everyone. Wishing you all the best in your learning, practice, working with vulnerability in your life, and developing wisdom, compassion, and freedom within it. Yeah, wishing you all the best.